So which Warhammer 40k miniatures are the most painful to put together and make hobbying just that little bit more of a slog? Let's talk through 7 examples of some kits in Warhammer 40k that plenty of people out there might not be too keen to build again. Hello and welcome back to Warspecs Tactics, where today I thought I'd do a slightly different video to talk about just a few examples of Warhammer 40k miniatures that perhaps aren't Games Workshop's most beloved creations for hobbyists and painters out there. Let's talk through just a few of the miniatures that might be quite far on the board, but the whole process of getting them put together, painted and then transported there could be a bit of a nightmare. I've certainly had a few experiences with a bunch of things on this list myself. I'll be interested to hear any of your guys' kits that really caused you grief. First up, we'll kick off with talking about a classic one, the standard Space Marine drop pod. This one's known to be an irritating kind of kit to put together, as it's basically a 5-way mirror image of 5 different moving doors that can either be held in the up position or splayed out like you can see here. And even when you get it all painted, it's not exactly going to be one of the most exciting miniatures in your army, basically being almost like battlefield terrain for being a hunk of metal that your Space Marines just jumped out of. The main issue with this thing is that you need to get all the panels together at kind of the same sort of time, given that it pretty much forms a circle. Maybe not the easiest while you're trying to coordinate plastic glue or super glue drying all at the same time, and I've seen plenty of people trying to hold it together with rubber bands and things to try and prevent cracks forming. It does feel like one of the kits that's very hard to get exactly perfectly right and not have any cracks appearing between the panels, and also making sure that all of those panels can actually move and go up and down as they're intended to, if you do want to be able to flex them in and out to deploy your forces onto the field. From there you're then left with a miniature that, as I said, I wouldn't consider one of the most exciting miniatures in your army, that just has a ridiculously massive amount of surface area to paint on it. It's quite a big chunky thing and would be the equivalent of a tank or vehicle pretty much, just if you had to paint the outside. But if you do want it to be able to deploy like this, then it's got really quite a lot of internal mechanisms and things, never mind the surfaces on the underside of all the flaps. In hindsight for this one, I'd certainly recommend the most basic colour scheme that you can possibly apply to it. Some metal effect and washing for the vast majority of it is probably going to be fine. It kind of wants to be a backdrop to the main miniatures anyway. At the moment, I'll admit a drop pod is one of the miniatures that I have sitting on my shelf amongst many more. I sort of half painted the thing and I wound up hard edge highlighting all around the outside of it, but I sort of can't really bear to finish it at the moment, given that it's perhaps one of the firstborn miniatures that is some kind of threat of Games Workshop either removing it or replacing it, and I really don't like the idea of putting quite a lot more effort into it only for it to promptly get removed. I guess it's probably going to stay on the shelf unless I desperately need it for any one army list, I suppose. It is probably worth mentioning the Tyranid equivalent, the Tyrannocyte, as well. This one's not got the moving parts, but it does have the same sort of assembly, and perhaps more than anything else, this one has some very spindly little tentacles that it's perched on. I feel like if you do just go the normal way and just glue these onto the base as Games Workshop seem to intend, then good luck getting that to not snap off in transit. You've got something that's just enormously top heavy with all that big hunk of plastic just perched on a few tiny little tendrils. Next up, and also perhaps kind of classically seen as a bit of a problem miniature, is the Ghost Ark for the Necrons. I'll admit I do quite like the design of this guy. Basically a double row of Necron warriors in an open arc that's protected by quantum shielding. Pretty much a mysterious and disturbing Tomb World landing craft with a bunch of Gauss flares mounted on the sides. However, this kit is kind of famously easy to go wrong with. It's got a whole bunch of ribbed parts that line up in order, and to my understanding, if you don't get them to fully fit flush with the part behind them, then it tends to look very wrong in design and basically gives you Ghost Ark a bendy sort of appearance, which isn't really the Eldritch architecture that you're probably going for. On top of that, due to the sheer amount of surfaces and all those Necron warriors in the middle and other sides of each of the little arms of the Ghost Ark on each side, it's probably worth painting it in sub-assemblies while you're doing that slightly complex construction, as you're not going to have very easy access to get to those warriors if all the little frills are intact. Even if you do manage to get everything absolutely perfect, then you still wind up with a really quite fragile model. It's got one of the old school flying bases, which doesn't really help too much with that, but also all those little Gauss flares are all quite exposed and spindly parts on the underside of the model, and on a big weighty model, again, they're just asking to get snapped off. Overall quite a fun design, but I have heard plenty of anecdotes of Necron players having built one of these and then firmly deciding not to go for any more. Otherwise, as a bit more of a broad category of 40k miniatures, another one of the areas that tends to get complained about more is the Citadel old Failcast resin. Notably, it tends to be so varied in quality that they dropped the initial Failcast branding from it really quite quickly. when it was clear that the cast of these things was often anything but fine. These guys were originally brought in to replace the old metal miniatures. Games Workshop's version of a non-toxic resin that, unlike Forge World resin, doesn't have the tendency to create quite as much easy toxic dust, while also being able to realise moulded sculpts in a way that plastic couldn't. Perhaps the single biggest complaint that I usually see about these is that they often tend to have warping on slender parts of the models. Say, for example, at one point I painted up these older style warlocks as a mini painting project, and quite a lot of the blades were just curved in ways that no sword would normally be. In theory, can be fixable with a little bit of heat applied, though it's not always all that straightforward, and you can only be so rough with the parts as well as being kind of bendy. Resin does tend to be a bit more brittle than plastic to work with. There's been plenty of other problems reported over the years, anything from models being covered with flash or releasing agent to occasional bubbling. In fairness, Games Workshop do generally tend to be quite forthcoming with replacements if the miniatures they provide are warped or basically unusable. But overall, it's perhaps not too surprising that they don't tend to issue any new miniatures in Failcast type resin anymore. It's all either plastic or Forge World resin these days. Otherwise, for another few miniatures that tend to get brought up whenever hard models to assemble and paint come up tend to be the Admech range. I'd say that most people don't really have any major complaints about the looks for them. Little Martian cyborg tech men do look rather cool, but their miniatures are a bit nightmarish to get together and put on the table. Compared with a lot of miniatures of their size, they really are quite hyper detailed, with all sorts of trailing cables and extra bits and servo arms turning up all over them, and even on the individual miniature bodies they do tend to have really quite a lot of different textures going on. Various types of material paired with armor plates and metallic bits. That can certainly take a lot of time to get painted up in a way that looks good. One thing that I did notice about some of the miniatures as well is they come with just an enormous amount of parts for the size of miniature that you get. For example, this Iron Strider here I would rate as a relatively simple miniature as the range goes, basically a guy on stilt legs piloting a chicken walker that's piloted by a second Skitari. But this miniature comes in no less than 75 different pieces. Really quite a lot of the fine details have their own individual bits that need gluing in separately. I made up a squadron of them with all options magnetised between them and dragoons, and it certainly took a fair amount of time. As well as that, all that fine detail again adds up to a lot more surface area to paint and work out. Say for example, these Taraxi miniatures might be basically normal human-sized jump infantry, but the wings are kind of massive. And of course, Admech being Admech, they tend to be expensive and not really all that many points in game, so you likely need to paint up quite a lot of these before you've got a credible force going. You can need quite a lot of miniatures to make up a functional army. Finally, perhaps just to round out the list of potential miniature annoyances, there are some of the easiest miniatures to break as well. You can see here just with the Taraxi and the Ballistarius that they've got lots of little spindly bits sticking out, at least relative to the model's overall bulk. Just means that it could be very easy to lose the odd aerial or wingtip or things like that as you're transporting them from place to place unless enormous care is taken. Next up, I think perhaps a special shout out is worthy for flight stands. Games Workshop do make a fair few versions of these. It seems like in newer miniatures, a lot of them are just trying to have themselves perched on terrain in one way or another, and try and avoid the need for these clear plastic rods that have the models sort of hover above their bases. I certainly feel that there's some flight stands that do their jobs a little bit better or worse. There's certainly a bit of a fragile point on a miniature, given that even for the old ones, if you put too much pressure on them with a big bulky model on top, they are going to snap. The plastic that they have is pretty strong, but it's also really quite brittle too. Certainly I'd say for the vast majority of miniatures that you might glue your flight stand into, I think it's usually asking for trouble if you do. It just means that if any significant amount of direct pressure is put on the model, then it's going to break as opposed to the miniature fall off the stand, though it does maybe vary a bit as per the miniature in question. Some of them tend to stay on with friction, but I'd say ones like the Inceptors and Suppressors with the sort of curved ball and socket flight stand tend not to do that very well, and I have seen multiple people trying to get around this in various different ways. I quite like mounting a magnet at the top of the flight stand so they can be lifted on and off, or could try and tailor the end a little bit so you can sort of pin it to the model as opposed to have the ball and socket joint. I've seen some people do that for things like Custodes jet bikes. It is a little bit annoying though when a model comes with a flight stand or something like that and you sort of feel obligated to try and make it a bit better for fear of the miniature breaking. Otherwise, for a couple of honourable mentions, I'd say that Orc trucks, along with quite a lot of other transport vehicles it seems, might be one that could get people a bit more irritated. They do again have really quite a lot of jutting out bits that might be liable to fall off or break. Though admittedly I feel like for the orcs that's kind of lore accurate, a bit more so than Mechanicus or Space Marine type things. Again, it is one of the miniatures that has an absolute ton of surfaces to paint when you're done. I did paint one of these myself in the distant past, and I was kind of surprised at just how much time it wound up taking, even with a fairly rough and ready paint job deserving of orky scrap creations. Otherwise probably worth a mention for horde armies as well. I guess not really the fault of the individual miniatures, but there's nothing really quite as much for a hobby starting to take a bit of a chore as opposed to having to assemble the 80th or 90th miniature on the production line. You're probably quite well accustomed to the best way to assemble and paint them by that point, but it's definitely going to be a little bit more hobby work as opposed to hobby fun at that point. The effect on the table is quite fun though. I do enjoy playing ranked up guard infantry. Finally though, and perhaps always going to be the king of this list, I feel like whatever Games Workshop's creations might be currently, for difficulty for assembling and transporting miniatures, it's probably going to pale into comparison to the metal miniatures of old, which I'm sure for many people watching might not even have been a thing at the time when they entered the hobby. It is kind of surprising that Games Workshop still actually has some metal miniatures in their range, despite almost everything getting replaced by Failcast style miniatures. Say for example Ezekiel of the Dark Angels, although I guess he's probably going to be expecting a plastic model replacement at some point with the Dark Angels release. Metal miniatures were certainly where Games Workshop started out though, lots of pewter style miniatures in the past. That was initially the only way of doing things before they had plastic injection moulding, and then from there they swapped out the pewter models to the more white metal type things, and then eventually to the fine cast style resin, material costs and things being a big part of that. At least in the earlier days of Warhammer, metal miniatures could handle a lot more detail than plastic could, so they were the material of choice for characters and things or anything else a bit more ornately detailed, whereas plastic was generally kept for the rank and file. I must admit, even though I do come from the days of metal miniatures, it is quite cool when you've still got some miniatures that have some suitable weight to them. Despite that though, I never really enjoyed working with them that much. Generally a fair bit harder to put together and needing some cunning positioning and holding to allow things for glue to set. I certainly must have glued and re-glued Space Marine Devastator arms to the miniatures that wouldn't stay on for them, at least when I was younger. I feel like I had the good fortune to avoid the vast majority of the metal miniatures that were considered more problematic though. I certainly heard plenty of stories of people who certainly weren't getting on with their bigger metal miniatures, particularly things that had big overhanging parts with a lot of weight to them, say for example this Lord of Change with his wings. Unless pinned correctly, they could really quite easily fall off without too much provocation, and just be kind of hard to get to stay on the thing in the first place. Some metal miniatures also seemed almost asking for trouble, such as this old school Sister Battle Penitent engine as well. Somebody thought it would be a great idea apparently to try and perch a really quite heavy metal miniature all on just one tiny foot joint, and given how little material there is around that, good luck trying to get it back attached again if it breaks off. Otherwise for miniatures, maybe a bit more frequently brought up in discussion were the old Tyrannid gargoyles, managing to combine both flying bases and heavy metal miniatures. Definitely not a recipe for trouble there or anything, or things like the Land Raider Crusader with its metal hurricane bolters. That's one I did have the experience of, they were definitely a pain to get lined up. I do still have that guy in my collection though, and he has been seeing a bit of table time in 10th. Perhaps the apex king of them all, though, for hard miniatures to put together, might be the Metal Thunderhawk gunship that Games Workshop used to have. This one's a miniature back from the 90s that's often cited as one of the single hardest 40k miniatures to put together. So much heavy metal parts here that it's going to give itself some significant problems with its own sheer weight, and basically needs a ridiculous amount of pinning and metal superstructure to try and keep it together in the first place. 412 resin kits definitely have their challenges and are more recommended for more expert hobbyists still as per Games Workshop's web store, though I feel like even they are significantly easier to handle than this. It is a pretty cool mad relic of Games Workshop's past though. In any case, looking forward to hearing a few miniature horror stories from yourselves. What have been some of the ones that you've struggled most with in your hobby history, whether it's modelling, painting, or difficulty transporting? Look forward to hearing all your anecdotes down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new videos just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics has a Patreon page as well, and if you'd like to keep these kind of videos coming, any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.